Again, if you were with us last summer, you may remember the series Who Dat? Obscure Characters from the Old Testament. And we had so much fun and found it really fascinating how much you could learn from obscure characters in Scripture that we're doing another Who Dat series 2.0. And we're looking at obscure characters from the New Testament. Because while the main characters may get all the ink, insignificant characters, or at least quote-unquote insignificant characters, they have great lessons for us because every role played in God's plan really matters. And so we would say that we called them familiar characters that we never knew because even though they were obscure, they were very relevant to our lives once we got to know them. In many ways, they are a lot like us. And so we begin each week with giving you the character of the week, and we ask how many of you know the character. So if you are familiar with the character and story of Claudius Lysias, please raise your hand. Raise them high because I'm counting. Claudius Lysias. Let's see, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Only raise your hand once. Okay, 10. There were 4 in the first service, so that's 14. I got a pretty good shot for the obscure character of the summer right there, okay? So I'm very excited about that. Now, Claudius Lysias was a commander in the Roman army. And in the passage of the day from Acts 22, in the particular passage that we've selected to hear, you won't hear his name, Claudius Lysias. But in the passage, you will hear the commander. And so anytime you hear in the passage the commander, that is Claudius Lysias. So we're going to ask Sherry Cowger to please go up and read the scripture. And as she makes her way on up, I'm going to ask you to please stand and face the center of the room. And we read from the center of the room as a reminder to us where scripture is to be in our lives, both individuals, as families, and as a community of faith. It is to be central. And so, Sherry, whenever you're ready, I should say, please read from Acts 22.
The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priest and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them.
Sherry, thank you very much. You may be seated. Now, we know the commander's name is Claudius Lysias because in Acts 23, he writes a letter to Governor Felix because he's transferring Paul in Acts 23 to Governor Felix who lives in Caesarea. And in that letter, he identifies himself as Claudius Lysias. But why does the story of Claudius Lysias matter? Well, there's a lot of craziness. I don't think I have to convince you of this. There's a lot of craziness in life, and we call it chaos. And as a pastor, I'm aware of the chaos many of you face. And then there's a lot of stuff I'm not aware of, but I know it's there. Some of you, you're facing some kind of financial mess, a personal economic crisis, maybe job stress or job loss, or you have piles of debt. For others of you, it may be some kind of family disorder, a marriage on the rocks, relational turmoil with kids, parents, or siblings, or maybe just simply broken friendships. For others, it's uncertain health, where some of you are facing some very significant medical concerns. And others of you have loved ones who may be facing death itself. And it's fair to ask, where is God in the chaos? And the story of Claudius Lysias gives us insight to that common question. Now, Claudius Lysias, as I said, he appears in Acts 21, 22, and 23. He's a commander in the Roman army. The Roman Empire, just as a reminder, is the world power of the day. And as a commander, he led a force of somewhere between 600 and 1,000 soldiers. He's a significant commander. And he's stationed in Jerusalem at the Tower of Antonia, which is a tower that overlooked the temple area. And he says that he bought his Roman citizenship at a considerable price. And a Roman citizenship, it was a rare privilege in the Roman Empire, and you could either be, one, born a citizen like Paul was. You could, two, buy a citizenship like the commander did, Claudius Lysias. Or if you served an extended period in the military, you could gain citizenship. Obviously, Claudius hadn't done that yet, otherwise he wouldn't have paid for his. And he intervenes during the riot surrounding Paul in the temple area. Now, as I said, he's stationed at the Tower of Antonia, overlooking the Temple of Jerusalem. It's on the northwest side of the temple area. And go ahead and put a picture of up there. Now, that's not even the ruins or the actual thing. That's a model makeup of what they think it probably looked like. And so here you have the temple area, and up here you have the tower that overlook. And there were stairs that would go from these towers directly into the temple area, because oftentimes in Jerusalem, in the temple area, there was significant unrest. And you had to have a military presence in order to keep the peace. In fact, to this day, if you were to go to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, you will see some kind of military presence there. Guys carrying machine guns in order to keep the peace. Some things don't change even after 2,000 years. But he is stationed, him and his garrison are stationed in that tower. Now, a quick summary of Acts chapters 21 to 23. Paul returns to Jerusalem. Probably this takes place in the late 50s, about 25 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He is attacked by a mob in the temple area. He's arrested by Claudius Lysias. He's eventually interrogated by the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish ruling council. And then there is a plot to kill Paul. And when Claudius learns of the plot to kill Paul, he has Paul transferred to Caesarea, which is a city on the coast of the Mediterranean, to testify to the governor, Governor Felix. And in these 3 chapters of Acts, the lives of Claudius Lysias and Paul, they intersect. And they live in a chaotic world. Verses 22 to 24, the crowd listened to Paul until he said this. And then they raised their voices and they shouted, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." And as they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander, that'd be Claudius, ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks, and he directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. They lived in an uncertain time. In Acts chapter 21, when Paul's arrested, Claudius asks Paul, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started the revolt?" Now, the book of Acts doesn't talk about this revolt that Claudius is referring to here. But basically, not too long before this encounter, a couple of years at the most, there was a false prophet from Egypt, probably Jewish by birth, and he gathered 4,000 anti-Roman extremists on the Mount of Olives overlooking the city of Jerusalem. And he prophesied that the walls of Jerusalem would miraculously fall, sort of like the walls of Jericho did, and that God would give him and his 4,000 men victory over the Romans. It didn't turn out that way. The governor at the time, again, Governor Felix, he countered this force, and he killed or captured many of the followers of this false prophet. However, the Egyptian prophet himself managed to escape. And the Romans were hunting him, probably not too unlike how we were hunting bin Laden for many years. And Claudius thinks that Paul might be this guy. See, Claudius lived in uncertain times. It wasn't peaceful to be where he was. And we're familiar with this. We live in uncertain times. And we often are tempted to think, oh, if we could only go back to the good old days when there were simpler times. Oh, the good old days, the simple times. When would those simple times have been? Talking the 20th century? You mean the century of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Cold War? Or in 1918, when they had the world flu pandemic that killed 50 to 100 million people worldwide in less than a year? Or the time of Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini? Or the Russian October Revolution? The rise of the USSR? The Great Depression? Pearl Harbor? The Holocaust? Watergate? The assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., the Oklahoma City bombing, or the bombing of the trade towers, the bombing that didn't bring them down? Those simple times? I think we're going to have to back up another century. Let's go to the 19th century. What happened in the 19th century? Oh yeah, that little thing called the Civil War. And if you don't like change, trust me, you did not want to live in America in the 19th century because America was changing dramatically. Even just simple things like states being added to the Union all the time. All the time. How much was the country changing by the states being added? Well, I'm just going to illustrate you by showing the flags of the United States. Because every time you added a state to the Union, what do you have to do to the stars? You need to add a couple stars, one for every state. There were 22 different American flags during the 19th century. That's how often the country was changing. Now, if you wanted to be patriotic in the 19th century, and you wanted to keep an updated flag to fly in your front yard, you had to buy a new flag every couple years. Because every time you turned around, they would change it, and you need to buy a new one. The American flag, it was the iPhone of the 19th century. So we're going to have to back up another century. Let's go to the 18th century. Oh, wait, that was the Revolution. Let's not go there. Let's go to the 17th century. Do you know what a major part of the 17th century was called? The General Crisis. Who wants to live through that? The general crisis, there was widespread chaos and collapses in politics, economics, and society. In the 1640s, there were more state breakdowns in the world than any other time in human history. Oh, and there was the 30 Years' War, but never mind that. What about the 16th century? Well, there was a little thing called the Reformation, which while as Protestants we celebrate it, it really wasn't a time of peace and stability. How far back do you want to go to find simpler times? Uncertain times are the norm. It's the times when it seems simple. That's when it's rare. There are also uncertain circumstances where Paul is seized in the temple. He's beaten. He's arrested. He's about to be flogged. And when he appeals to citizenship, Claudius sends him to the Sanhedrin, the ruling council of the Jews. And in that meeting, they become violent again, and Claudius has to take him away again. Now, sometimes things happen that make us wonder what God is doing. There's a story about Jesus, and he's with his disciples in a boat, and they get caught in this really bad storm, and they fear for their lives. And what is Jesus doing in the boat? He's sleeping. And we find ourselves in circumstances that could cause us to wonder, Jesus, are you sleeping? And we face uncertain futures. Again, for Paul, there was this threat upon his life. And Claudius Lysias sends him to Caesarea with nearly 500 soldiers guarding him. That's how significant the plot to kill him was. And in addition to that, Claudius Lysias was worried about his own future because he did not uphold the rights of a Roman citizen properly. And he needs to make sure that that doesn't come back to cost him. Uncertain time, uncertain circumstances, uncertain future. Welcome to our world. This is us. But God cares in the chaos. As it says in the passage of the day, as they stretched Paul out to flog him, he said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" And when the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. And those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. And the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. And so the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. And then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. You see, God doesn't always, or actually, God doesn't necessarily take the chaos away. And as I started to say, a better sentence is God doesn't always take the chaos away. Because sometimes God does take away the chaos. Again, going back to the story about Jesus in the boat and he's sleeping. Well, when the disciples woke him up and they said, "Don't you care if we drowned?" Jesus stands up and he calms the storm. And asking God to calm the storm is always a good idea. But sometimes God may say, "No, I won't." But just because God may say, "No, I won't," doesn't mean that God doesn't care. You may remember that when Jesus was in the garden and he asked the Father, "Take this cup from me," he was asking to not have to go to the cross. And even Jesus got a "No, I won't." But Claudius Lysias is how God watches over Paul. God doesn't take Paul's chaos away. He provides a way for Paul to make it through it. And what's the primary way? Well, Claudius Lysias is the primary person. And the primary way is he gets arrested. That's just like God. Here, I'll save you. I'll get you arrested. There you go. What more do you want? You know, last year when we did this series, we tried to find an obscure American hero or villain that would match the obscure Bible character. This year we expanded that, and because we still wanted to do it, but we didn't want to limit ourselves to American heroes and villains because we used most of those up that we could find last year. And so we are going with obscure world heroes or villains from history. And so here's a picture of this week's obscure hero from world history. Do you recognize this World War II hero? Now, it might help if I were to tell you the hero is the dog, not the man. Do you recognize this World War II hero, this dog? Who has heard of Gunner the dog? Just raise your hand. I just want to see. Anyone here got a couple? Okay. Yes. Gunner the dog. He was a stray male Kelpie found in Darwin, Australia during World War II. Now, Darwin, Australia was a strategic port a lot like Pearl Harbor was. And it was located in the Northern Territory of Australia. And about 2 months after Pearl Harbor was bombed, Darwin was bombed, also by Japanese forces. February 1942. They actually used about 200 more bombs on Darwin than they did at Pearl Harbor. Now, in the wreckage of that bombing, this dog was found by Australian Air Force personnel. And he was hurt in this bombing. He had a broken leg. And so the Air Force personnel take this dog to one of the doctors. And the doctor was hesitant to work on the dog because he needed to have a name and serial number. And so the Air Force personnel came up with one. They said, okay, his name is Gunner, and his serial number is 0000. And so the doctor mended his leg. Now, one of the soldiers, his name was Percy Westcott, he's the guy in the picture, he took Gunner under his care. In fact, Gunner would even sleep under his bed. But it wasn't too long before they noticed something about Gunner. You see, the Japanese, they kept bombing the Northern Territory of Australia. And in fact, over the next 18 months, over 100 times did the Northern Territory of Australia get bombed. That's once a week. Talk about chaos. But the soldiers noticed that Gunner had great hearing because he would whimper and jump and seek shelter before a bombing. He would do this 20 minutes before a bombing. Now, I don't know, how far do planes travel in 20 minutes? That's like a long way. And he wouldn't just hear the sounds before the sirens went off. He picked up the sounds of the planes before radar picked them up. The other thing that was amazing about Gunner is that he only did this, where he would whimper and jump and go seek shelter. He only did it with the enemy planes. When Allied planes would come, he wouldn't whimper and jump and seek shelter. He could tell the difference between an Allied plane and an enemy plane. Eventually, the wing commander allowed Prescott to sound the air raid siren anytime Gunner's whining and jumping alerted him to do so. And in all that chaos, Gunner the dog helped them through it. Now, I don't know if God orchestrated that, but that sure sounds like something God would do. You know? Oh, you're getting bombed once a week? Here, let me send you a dog. We'll help you out. You know, there's a theological term we'll talk about from time to time. It's called providence. That no matter how out of control things are or seem to be, they are not out of control for God. God provided Claudius Lysias, the right commander in the right place at the right time to help keep Paul safe by arresting him. He gave Paul just enough, God did, so that he could make it through that particular chaos. And that's really how God operates. He gives us just enough. Do you remember that when Jesus is carrying the cross? Well, God didn't take the cross away. He provided Simon from Cyrene to carry it for him. Gave him just enough. And again, my kids are teenagers, so obviously I worry a lot. But I really don't worry much about the little things. I'll take the little things that go wrong. I just don't want anything like majorly bad to happen, okay? But I don't know what the future holds. This is not in my control. I do not know what's going to happen. And so I just kind of hang on and keep moving forward, trusting that no matter what happens, God's going to see us through. And that he will give me just enough. Now, I would like an abundance of whatever it is I'm going to need to make it through. That's not how it usually works. I'm going to get just enough. God gives just enough. And that's really the great challenge of our faith. When God doesn't do what we want him to do, when he doesn't take our chaos away, when he doesn't give us an abundance to make it through the chaos, he gives us just enough to make it through. Will we trust God to get us through whatever chaos we are facing? Will we trust God to get us through it? That's not easy to do. The lesson of Claudius Lysias is to connect with God in the chaos. In Acts 23, we read, "The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, 'Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify in Rome.'" You see, it's not about what God gives us. Again, God has provided us with financial resources, some more than others. God's provided us with gifts and skills, some more than others. Provided us with opportunities, again, some more than others. He's provided us with all sorts of things to weather various storms. And all of these things, they are important and they're valuable. But they all have their limits. Whatever our resources may be, and some of us, we have great resources, and some of us, we have little resources. But whatever they may be, what will we do when they run out? Or when they can't solve a particular chaos that we face? What are we going to do? Well, when that happens, remember, God has always been with you. Jesus is not sleeping. We need to connect with him. It's not about what God gives us, it's about that God is with us. When I was a kid, I remember anytime there was a thunderstorm at night and I would get scared, I would crawl into my parents' bed. Which, if you think about it, that's just really dumb. Really? My parents' bed is any safer than my bed? No. If something's going to happen to the house, it doesn't matter what bed I'm in. Okay? But having my parents close, feeling their presence, knowing they were there, it gave me a sense of security in the storm. And I was able to get the rest that I needed to face the next day. The Bible tells us over and over again to not be afraid. And I just want to read some passages and have you listen and see why it tells us to not be afraid. Genesis 15. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. Isaiah 12. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid. The Lord himself is my strength and my defense, and he has become my salvation. Isaiah 44, do not tremble, do not be afraid. Did I not proclaim this and foretell it long ago? You are my witnesses. Is there any God besides me? No, there is no other rock. I know not one. Psalm 118, the Lord is with me, I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Joshua 1, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Psalm 23, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Psalm 27, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? As a pastor, I'm aware of the chaos many of you face. The financial messes, the family disorder, the uncertain health situations. God is with you. Jesus is watching over you. God goes before you, he stands behind you, and if necessary, he will carry you. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And when the peace of Christ comes, you can get the rest, and you can get the comfort, and you can get the encouragement to face the next day. What is the chaos that you need God to walk with you in? What is your current chaos? God is with you. Jesus is watching over you. Goes before you, stands behind you, will carry you if he needs to. Jesus is all of what we need.